The Montgomery County Historical Society, in association with Montgomery Community Media, present an exclusive discussion of the 2016 presidential election, sponsored by the Sanford and Doris Slavin Foundation, with award-winning journalists Steve and Cokie Roberts. And now, please welcome the Executive Director of the Montgomery County Historical Society, Matthew Logan.
Hi, my name is Matt Logan. I'm the Executive Director of Montgomery History. We are very pleased to see such a large crowd this evening and to have you join us. This is a very special evening for all of us, and I'm very excited about the program. Let me begin by thanking our host here tonight. Montgomery Community Media has been a tremendous partner and has assisted in all our preparations. I'd also like to thank the Slavin Foundation, whose financial support helped to make the event possible. My organization, Montgomery History, has been around since 1944. We do a lot of things that you would expect a history organization to do. We have exhibitions, we have a historic library, we manage the county's historic archives, we have a very active speakers bureau. So the question that I often hear is, so why is an organization that's ostensibly focused on history having a program about a current topic, like the elections? And there's really two good answers to that. The first is that we consider an informed citizenry to be the bedrock of our democracy. That historic understanding is absolutely essential to making good decisions. And that's not only for us as voters, but also for our leaders. And so that is a critical component for good decision making, building stronger communities, and making better policy. The second is, and I'm sure you've heard this before, that journalism is history's first rough draft. And tonight we have our special guests, our expert not only in history, but also they're acclaimed journalists. And so we're very lucky to have them with us. That, you know, I could run through their resume for you, but I think you're all familiar with both Steve and Cokie Roberts. What you may not know about them, however, is their commitment to Montgomery County. They live here locally, they are civic-minded, they are down to earth, they are local, and they care about the community and the same issues that we care about. And so with that, I would like to introduce Cokie Roberts and Steve Roberts.
Steve is actually on the board of the Historic Society, but I feel that I personally am Montgomery history. Having moved to Montgomery County, to the house where we still live, 64 years ago. It is a lot of history that I have seen here, and how wonderful it is to be able to celebrate it, and also to do it with the Montgomery County media, because this is really an important part of the county, to have this ability to get the news about what's going on locally out, because that's really dying. We can talk about that later if you like, about what's happening in terms of local news and newspapers. And so to have this fabulous, beautiful place with good reporters and good shows to tell voters, particularly at this time of year, but the citizenry as a whole, what's going on is a really important thing. And I want to thank the Slavin Foundation. Jeffrey Slavin drove me here tonight. Jeffrey is my I am his great babysitter, because I was his babysitter's babysitter. So that makes me his great babysitter.
It's great, baby.
And when he says it, I want to kill him. But you know, he's doing enough good work that I'll let him live. It is with joy that we are here.
Well, it is, and I'm the newcomer. I've only lived here 39 years. Although Cokie and I live in the house she grew up in on Bradley Boulevard, as some of you know. We got married in the yard of that house 50 years ago last month.
And Jeffrey crashed the wedding.
And we came back from Europe and moved in with her mother for what we thought would be a month, and quickly realized
Evicted her.
we evicted her. Yes, that is true. We did. We gave her some money to go find another place, but we did evict her. And this has been home for a long time. We've raised our kids here. Our children went to Montgomery County Public Schools. And I've had the great pleasure in the last few years of growing closer to the county because Steve Hull at Bethesda Magazine was nice enough to ask me some years ago to write a column called Hometown, which I write in every issue of Bethesda Magazine, and that has brought me much closer to the history and the characters of Montgomery County, including the great diversity. A lot of people don't realize that Montgomery County today, you take the census definition of non-Hispanic white, is 46%. The county is 30% foreign-born. It's a wonderfully rich and diverse place that is changing in all sorts of wonderful ways. And that assignment at Bethesda Magazine led me to, or led a publisher called Arcadia, which does a lot of books about communities around the country, to ask me about a year ago to write a book about this area. So actually next month, my new book on the history of Bethesda and Chevy Chase will be coming out. So it's a, and when I started researching that book, I went to Matt Logan and Montgomery County Historical Society. They were extremely nice. And as they were very nice to me, they said, and by the way, would you come on the board? At that point, I really couldn't say no because they had been so nice to me. So it's been a wonderful association, and we really appreciate your invitation, and we'll try to talk a little bit about the election and what's going on. So Cokie will start.
So we're gonna talk briefly, and most of this evening will be your questions. But I will tell you that at ABC now we're getting daily tracking polls, which just make you crazy, because you think he's up, she's down, he's up, and today she's down because this tracking poll started over the weekend with Hillary Clinton 12 points up. She moved to 9 points up, and now she's down to 6 points up. So you're seeing a movement toward Trump as sort of the scandals have gotten out of people's minds. It doesn't take long. He was here today dedicating the new hotel. She was in Florida with Jose Andres. I mean, only Washingtonians get this, but who, of course, is suing him because of that hotel. So it is still a volatile election. This election is not over, and people keep thinking it's over, but it's not. And it is mainly not over.
You just caused several heart attacks, and this audience, I might.
Then they, get over it. It's mainly not over because the country is deeply divided, and so you're going to basically have 40-some% of the people for the Republican candidate and 40-some% of the people for the Democratic candidate, and the question is which one has the 48 and which one has the 44, and at the moment it's been running with Hillary Clinton having that, and she's been doing better in the battleground states, but it is still not over. And it is because the country is just so divided. And in fact, in our tracking poll today, they asked the question, are you anxious? And it says, the results on anxiety demonstrate the sharp polarization in the race. Clinton supporters, 93%, we never get that number about anything, are anxious at the idea of a Trump presidency. 84% makes them very anxious, and the opposite is true among Trump supporters. 90% anxious about a Clinton as president, 76% highly so. So it's a very divided country. Now people, and one of the things we want to do here tonight is give you a little bit of context here, being as it is an historical society. And people do ask me all the time, I mean, absolutely all the time, is this the most polarized time ever? Now, it kind of upsets me because it makes me think that they think I was there covering Adams, Jefferson, and it's not. It is not the most polarized time ever. Among other things, they're not shooting each other, which is a plus. Metal detectors, good. You know, the Burr-Hamilton duel is just the most famous. They actually shot each other all the time. They would, the term of art was to call someone out. They'd call each other out on the floor of the House of Representatives and then go out to Bladensburg, where there was a dueling ground, and shoot each other. And it was a common occurrence. And so that was bad. And by the way, think of Burr-Hamilton, the sitting vice president of the United States murdered his political enemy over political speech. Now, our most recent vice president had a problem with a gun, but as far as I know, it wasn't that. And in fact, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner this year, which we don't have to go to, thank God, because you can now watch it on TV. But President Obama looked out and said, "There's my Vice President, Joe Biden. I love Joe. He's been a great vice president. Didn't shoot anybody in the face." So this is not our most partisan time ever. Our most partisan, polarized time ever was the time right before the Civil War, particularly here in Maryland. But that led to war. It was the incredible failure, and it makes me crazy every time I think about it. It was the incredible failure of the political system, which I believe in, to be able to get to emancipation without murdering or killing close to 600,000 Americans. So we don't want to repeat that period. It was not one that we want to see again. But it is, in the course of our history, one of the most polarized and partisan times ever. And we know from all kinds of measures that Democrats are more liberal than they have been in past years, and Republicans more conservative, and the center has disappeared. And you know, that hasn't always been the case. People used to be able to get along together. In fact, as late as the 1990s, both the House and Senate, more than half, were in the middle. Voting records were between the most conservative most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat, and that's just not true anymore. And it is something that I have seen disappear over my lifetime. I had the great honor, the daunting honor, a couple of years ago, of being asked to give the eulogy at Betty Ford's funeral. And I would have been absolutely terrified, except that Mrs. Ford told me exactly what she wanted me to say, which made it a great deal easier.
Before she died.
Yes, before. True, before she died. And what she wanted me to talk about was how things used to be. And she had been there in my last interview with President Ford. And he said to me, "You know, Cokie, I just don't understand what's going on in Washington." Now, this was before it got anywhere near as bad as it is now. And he said, "You know, when I was minority leader of the House of Representatives, and your dad, my father, Hale Boggs, was the majority leader," he said, "you know, we'd get in a cab together," which is an exaggeration, they had drivers, but still. We'd get in a cab together and we'd go downtown to some place like the Press Club. And we'd say, "What are we going to argue about?" And he said, "Now look, it was a legitimate argument. We genuinely disagreed about means to an end. And it was partisan, for heaven's sakes. We were the leaders of our parties in the House of Representatives. But then we get back in the cab and be best friends." And that's true. And that was a world where things got done. and where people saw each other as the opposition, not the enemy, and no one's motives were questioned of whether they were evil to be serving in the other party in the Congress. And that has just completely changed. People in Congress now don't get in a cab together with people in their own party, much less the opposite party. So a lot of things have changed, and the other question I get all the time is why? And I sort of boil it down to 4 or 5 things. One is the families aren't here. And it's always amusing for those of us who live here because, you know, Washington is portrayed as some sort of Sodom on the Potomac. You know, I don't know, I've never seen it. I suspect you haven't either. But, you know, that if a family moves here, that they're somehow going native and that it will corrupt them. It is, I mean, there are economic reasons, and I get that, but still, it is this sense that Washington's an evil place and you can't come here. And then members live in their offices, which I find frankly disgusting, and I don't want to, I do, and I don't want to pay their rent as a taxpayer. But, so they don't have any of the normal conversations and camaraderie that families have when families are together. There's no PTA meetings, there's no going to church together, there's no running into each other at the cleaner, whatever it is. And so that's gone. The media, we're certainly co-conspirators. We give our, I mean, just even put aside the organizations that are devoted to partisanship on cable television and talk radio and in the blogosphere. Even the mainstream media, we give our microphones to the loudest shouters and not to the people who want to make sense. The permanent campaign. You have people constantly running for office, constantly raising money, but outside groups who have these scorecards and they have amendments come up in Congress just for the purpose of scoring someone in order to raise money around it. And so if you have gone against whatever that group thinks is an A on the scorecard, you're vilified. And so that militates against people coming together. And then there is the drawing of district lines. And again, I had a very interesting experience in the last year of the Bush presidency, where I got this call just out of the blue from the White House press secretary, Dana Perino, saying, President Bush wants to know if you would like to go with him out to Andrews Air Force Base when he goes to meet the Pope. And I said, okay. I'll see if I can, you know, clear the schedule. And so it was totally cool. You know, I got to the White House and got in the limousine with the President, Mrs. Bush, and Jenna. And it doesn't take long in a presidential motorcade, but we went out to Andrews, and he wanted to explain to me why he was breaking precedent, because normally, of course, the head of state comes to the White House. But he wanted to say how much he admired the Pope and what a strong moral force he was. And that led to a brief conversation about the church in America. And the bishops had been working hard for Bush's immigration bill. And so I asked him about that, and he said, you know, Cokie, and I'm quoting here, he said, I tried and tried and tried to get my party to do the right thing on immigration. And I couldn't do it because of the way district lines are drawn. Because they're drawn to be completely safe for both Democrats and Republicans. In Maryland, they're very safe for Democrats. And so the only way you get in trouble is to go against the orthodoxy. And therefore you get challenged in a primary, but in a general election, by and large, you can't lose. And so to be crossing the aisle and trying to get something done in a bipartisan fashion gets you punished in a primary, and to primary has become a very common verb, because somebody who says you're not pure enough as a liberal, as a Democrat, or as a conservative, as a Republican. And of course, so few people show up at primaries, and they are the true believers, that it makes it very, very difficult for anybody to have the courage to be ready to be constructive about legislation. And we've certainly seen that in recent years in the Congress, when anytime anybody tries it, they're slapped down so severely that speakers lose their speakerships and parties lose their majorities. So it is a very, very, very partisan time. And that divide is showing up in this election in a very significant way. But it's not just a partisan divide, it's a divide on race and class and sex and age, and Steve is going to talk about all that.
You know, the polls are fascinating. You know, as Cokie talks about the divisions in America, you look at the latest ABC poll, there are these fault lines that run through America. And in some ways, the Trump supporters, Clinton supporters are not living on different continents, they're living on different planets. The fault lines are race, gender, education, and geography. On race, Donald, in the ABC poll, it was a little skewed because it had a little larger margin for Clinton, and as Cokie said, it's been changing. But just a few days ago, Clinton was winning the non-white vote by 54 points. Trump was winning the white vote by 4 points, 54-4. If you look at gender, Clinton was winning the women's vote by 20 points, and she was winning the male vote by 3 points. If you look at education, people with a college degree were voting so heavily for Clinton that the margins were astounding. And if you combine education with gender, listen to these numbers. Men without a college degree were 30 points more likely to vote for Trump. Women with a college degree, 30 points more likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. A gap of 60 points based on gender and on education. You look at geography. I looked at the map the other day. This is the Real Clear Politics map of where it basically projects who's going to win. There's a no toss-ups map. So I looked at the states that border an ocean. There, by my count, my geography is a little shaky, but by my count, there are 17 states that border an ocean. The only two that are now projected to go for Trump are Georgia and South Carolina. Florida might switch, but of the 17 bordering an ocean, the coastal states, only 2 for Trump. You take the 14 states, and by the way, we're not including Gulf of Mexico in that. That's not an ocean. At least
it didn't work for
it didn't work for my analysis
right.
either. I mean, Alabama, Mississippi mess up the whole thing.
Louisiana, Texas.
If you look at the states that have no external borders, they don't border Mexico, they don't border Canada, they don't border the Great Lakes, don't border Gulf of Mexico, there are 14 of them. Only 2 are likely to vote Democratic, Nevada and Colorado. So these fault lines are enormous. And if you look at the map, the whole center of the country is red, the whole outer rim of the country is blue. And these are not just political differences. As Cokie was saying, what we've really happened in this country is that we've gone to a European model, which is not a compliment, where we basically have a liberal party we call the Democrats and a conservative party we call the Republicans. Not so long ago, and Maryland was a very good example of this, there were people like Mac Mathias, Gilbert Goody, who the road for whom is named right out here, right? Goody Drive.
His family, his history here.
Okay, his history. And it's not Michael Barnes Drive, it's Goody
Right.
Drive. It's a Republican. And that tradition that Mac Mathias, Connie Morella, and others from this area represented, this vibrant tradition of progressive Republicans who were fiscally conservative, but were also internationalists and civil libertarians, is almost entirely gone. And if you look at the Southern Democrats, who also provided a ballast for the Democratic Party. They're almost all gone too. So now, more than 90% of the Republicans are more conservative than the average Democrat. And 20 years ago, it was only 60%. Enormous shift in terms of polarization, and the same is true on the Democratic side. So what does this mean for the election? I think that there, quickly want to mention a couple of points. I think that one of the, we badly missed as journalists the Trump phenomenon for a variety of reasons. I don't think any one of us, including me and Cokie, would have predicted that he would win the nomination. I don't know of a single journalist of any repute who predicted that. I think we missed several things.
But a lot worried about it. I mean, there were from the beginning the warning cries, particularly from the conservative columnists.
Well, but they weren't concerned that he was going to win. They were concerned that he was not a true conservative, which he isn't. But some of this is on the plus and some is on the minus side. I think we, living in this community here, in some ways we had a blind spot to what was happening to the economy around the country. As I mentioned, the single most accurate indicator of a Trump voter is educational level. The less education someone has, the more likely they are to vote for Donald Trump. Now, I'm not saying they're unintelligent, that's not my point. But the trend is very, very clear. And the other marker of Trump voters is high anxiety about the economy. Now, if you put those two together, what does that tell you? It tells you that there are a lot of people in this country there are a lot of jobs out there. I was listening to NPR coming here. There's a company saying, a high-tech company that does, they said, we can't get enough computer engineers. But if you are a 50-year-old guy living in Altoona, Pennsylvania, who used to work in a steel mill, and that steel mill left, and you don't have the education to take advantage of those high-tech jobs that are being created, life is not very good for you at all. And I think a lot of us living in this community where virtually everybody we know does have the education, including our children and our neighbors who do have the education to take advantage of the jobs that are being created, I think we missed this phenomenon. I think we looked at the macro numbers and said 5% unemployment, jobs are being created, even incomes were going up.
Wages are the highest they've ever been.
But we missed this phenomenon of this anxiety out in the country of people, middle-aged people, particularly men, who don't have the education to take advantage of the jobs that have been created, and their old jobs have disappeared. I also think, and you've got to be very honest about this, I think we underestimated the amount of racism and xenophobia in the country. I've written 2 books about immigration, and I can tell you that Donald Trump is a very American figure, because periodically in our country, figures have arisen to oppose and resent and deride each wave of immigration that we have ever had in America. There was a party, Cokie talked about history, there's a party in America called the Know Nothing Party in 1840s.
Big in Maryland.
Huge. Their single biggest platform was opposing Catholic immigration, and particularly Irish Catholics.
And the big writer for them was Anna Carroll, out of the Carroll family. How does that happen?
In the 1880s, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred Chinese people from owning property. In the 1920s, you had Italians were considered non-white, and they were hanged in cities around the country as insidious dissidents. My people, the Jews, were discriminated against periodically all through this period. 1940s, we interned 140,000 loyal Japanese Americans. Every single time it's happened, the language has been the same, which is that America is now perfect. And the next group, the Germans, the French, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Jews, the Italians, the next group will degrade our culture and ruin what we have. And we're hearing exactly the same rhetoric about Hispanics and Muslims today. And when Donald Trump says this, he's a profoundly American character. These eruptions have been happening for over 200 years in this country. I think we fail to see its power. And that is another thing that we missed. But having said that, I think this election will be decided on 3 factors: demography, geography, and gender. And for all of Donald Trump's successes at exploiting a lot of the feelings in the country, economic and cultural. I think in the end there will be three factors that will make the difference. When I say demography, you have to understand how different a place America is today. And right here in Montgomery County, we see it. When I said that Montgomery County is only 40% non-Hispanic white, that's
schools
are even more.
So.
If you look at America and how it's changed so rapidly, people sometimes talk, Republicans, about recreating the coalition that elected Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, the electorate in this country was 88% white. In this election, it's going to be 70% white. You cannot recreate the coalition that elected Ronald Reagan because that America doesn't exist anymore. And so if you look at the changing face of America and the rising power of non-white voters and not just Hispanics. In an area like this, you also see the rising power of Asians, a coming political force in this county. And you go north of here, there are elementary schools in Gaithersburg where half the kids in that school are Chinese. And it's an enormous change in this county, and that reflects a change that's happening in a lot of places around the country. So the Republican Party, the smart Republicans, have warned against this repeatedly. Lindsey Graham has said repeatedly, senator from South Carolina, we're facing a demographic death spiral, direct quote, if we don't appeal more directly to the rising tide of immigrant and non-white voters. And of course, we know what's happened. The very reverse has happened. When I say geography, you have to, if you look at history, you see that many of you have seen this, this figure. But if you look at the last 6 elections, there have been 18 states that have voted Democratic in every one of these elections. They account for 242 electoral votes. You only need 270 to win. And we got to take a break. Let me make one final point. Gender is extremely important. We know about the gender gap. Barack Obama lost the white vote. Lost the male vote won the male vote. Mitt Romney won the male vote by 7 points. Barack Obama won the female vote by 11 points. That's why he's president. And we'll talk a little bit more about this after the break. But geography, demography, gender are going to decide this election.
And now we're going to take a break, and then we will come back and take your questions.
We'll be right back after these messages.
There's nothing Americans love more than posting online who you should vote for. You tweet and you snap and you gawk, but if you don't show up and vote, it's all just talk. Take a little time on November 8th to do your civic duty and renew your faith in the nation you want. Let them know the truth. The room where it happens is the voting booth. So
vote, vote, America. Vote, vote, the time is now. Vote, vote, decide who wins this. Vote.
We return to An Evening with Steve and Cokie Roberts.
Well, we're back and eager to hear what you all are interested in knowing. So we are ready to take your questions when you're ready to ask them. So who is the first questioner tonight?
Hi, my name is Will Stewart, and I live in Washington, D.C. My question is, what are the chances for an infrastructure bill being passed by the new Congress, and what would it likely include? Thanks.
Well, it depends on who's in the new Congress. And we don't really know the answer to that. You can go through a list of states and see a way that the Democrats take the Senate, and you can go through a list of states and see the way the Democrats don't take the Senate. And in the House of Representatives, there was a sort of moment there where they were thinking that they might pick up upwards of 30 seats. I think that's very, very, very unlikely. So it's a combination of the fact of who's controlling the Congress, and also whether people are willing to work across party lines. And infrastructure used to be a bipartisan proposition, always, but it has not been of late. And if, in fact, it is a Republican Congress and a Democratic president, and if, in fact, the Congress feels that their main mission is to thwart the president, and today, you know, they announced that they just see investigations going on forever. then I don't see a lot getting done about anything.
Except for one thing, which, as Cokie said, that used to be a bipartisan issue. That's because the best thing Congress does is spend money. They're not very good at paying for it, but there is a bipartisan common agreement that the economy could use a shot in the arm. Now, this is not true of the more conservative wing of the Republican Party, but I think a lot of business-oriented Republicans actually would support it. I mean, the Chamber of Commerce would be first in line for an infrastructure bill that would create a lot of jobs and a lot of work for a lot of businesses. So, this is a much larger question, but it is probably the one bill where you have, early on in a Congress, you might have some common agreement. But the single biggest question is going to be whether Paul Ryan, as the Speaker of the House, is able to work with the new president, assuming it's Hillary Clinton.
Or whether he's allowed to remain Speaker of the House.
That's even a threshold question. I think he would like to do an infrastructure bill, but I'm not sure that the base of his party would allow him. There's a long record there of the conservative base of the party opposing just about any government spending.
And the Republicans who are likely to lose are exactly the ones you were describing, the business-oriented Republicans.
Yeah, right.
My name is David Satinsky. I live in Potomac. Do you think that the way of registering and signing in voters will be changed because of issues raised by the present candidates?
I think the key factor is that in a lot of states, Republican-controlled legislatures actually made voting harder. I mean, this is a profoundly un-American idea. So many people have suffered over so many generations expanding the franchise, whether they were suffragettes, whether there was, and so many others. And yet, in a number of states, as Republicans took control, and as I remember, I said the changing demography. What a lot of them decided was we're never going to get these new people to vote for us, so the way we keep winning is by not letting them vote at all. I mean, that frankly was the calculation. But what has happened is that there have been legal challenges in many states to these, and there's been a wide agreement on the part of federal judges, Republicans as well as Democrats, that a lot of these changes are illegal. And that they violate due process and a variety of other constitutional provisions, and that the argument for them that Trump has been using on the stump, but it predated Trump, that election fraud was rampant, and that was essential to creating these new safeguards. State after state, judge after judge said it's not true, that there's no evidence at all of any significant fraud. So actually, I think that what is really changing, the mechanism that is changing the process of voting and registration is actually federal lawsuits.
But even so, the states have been getting around them and making it very difficult for a lot of people to vote.
Well, how many divisions does the Supreme Court have, right? I mean, locally people can drag their feet, but I think the trend is very clear. Because after all, in these cases, the states had to make their best case. The justification for voter ID laws was that there was fraud. So when they were challenged in the court, they had to come to the courts and make the case that here's the fraud that justifies, and they were never able to do it. Every single federal judge who's looked at it said it's a sham. It's a phantom. To use a phrase from a Republican judge in Wisconsin, there's a phantom issue. But, as Cokie says, each individual registrar, each individual election board can still make life hard. But the long-run trend is actually toward reversing a lot of those laws.
My name is Jonathan Miller. I'm from Rockville. So LBJ and Sam Rayburn made a conscious decision when President Eisenhower was elected to work with him, to cooperate with him, because they saw it as their duty as Americans to get done what they could get done. So why can't Senator McConnell and Paul Ryan come to this same conclusion?
Well, I think I talked about that a lot in my opening remarks. I mean, the world is a very different place from where it was in 1952, 53, by the time he took office, and even a very different place from where it was in 1993. I mean, we've all just seen, because it was trending after Trump made his statement about not perhaps leaving us in suspense about whether he would accept the results of the election. What then started showing up was George H.W. Bush's letter to Clinton, which was waiting for President Clinton when he got into the Oval Office. And And he said, you're going to have a lot of problems, but now your problems are our problems, and your success is our success. You are our president. And that was the view. And that's what sort of American presidents had done, sometimes under duress, but had done, really from the time that Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams and we had our first peaceful transfer of power. But I think in the last 2 elections, it's been very, very tough. A lot of Democrats did not recognize George W. Bush as a legitimate president because of the recount and the Supreme Court decision. And a lot of Republicans didn't recognize Barack Obama as a legitimate president because of race. And that's what the whole birther thing was all about. So we're living in very different times from that.
And one statistic I didn't quote to you, there's been a study, Pew Research Center did a very good study of the electorate recently. And one of the most alarming statistics they came up with was not just this partisanship that I mentioned, 90% of Democrats are more liberal and Republicans conservative, but the attitudes within that polarization. About 1/3 to 40% of the members of each party think the other party is a threat to the national interest.
Which is why there's such high anxiety around this election.
Right, because so this is not just they're wrong. This is not just I disagree with them. This is they're evil. They are a threat to America's well-being. When you get that level of animosity, you say, why can't they do it? But now this is not true of everybody. I think Paul Ryan, if things were different, they'd be different. If Paul Ryan, if the party that he represents was what you saw when Connie Morello was in the Congress 20 years ago, and there were more Connie Morellos, I think he would have been in much better position to negotiate. But you saw what happened to John Boehner. John Boehner, I think, was a professional legislator who truly wanted to negotiate with Obama. And what happened to him? He got deposed.
Both of them actually had their legs cut out from under them, both Obama and Boehner, when they tried to negotiate.
And by the way, this is not all on the Republican side.
That's what I'm saying.
Because if you look at what Bernie Sanders has been saying in the last few days, Bernie Sanders has been saying, I'm going to declare war. The minute Hillary Clinton is elected, I'm going to pressure her from the left. I'm going to make sure she comes in with a pure liberal program. He's going to oppose, he's announced he's going to oppose appointments that he doesn't like. So it's not just the Republicans who are pulling this apart. And the fact is that if you look at Bernie Sanders' proposals, that the ones that he says he's going to push, there is, first of all, there is no conceivable way any of them can ever get enacted.
Passed.
None. Plus, as the Wall Street Journal did, they calculated the total cost of Bernie Sanders' proposals, and they came to $18 trillion with absolutely no idea of how you're going to pay for it. So this is not just on one side. There are forces pulling the centrists, the deal makers, the pragmatists, whatever words you want to use, apart on both sides.
Next question, please. Oh, I'm glad there's finally a lady.
There's a couple of us. I'm Debbie Dreisman from Potomac, Maryland. Given how divisive this election has been, what does the incoming president have to do to bring the country back together?
Well, I'm not sure that it's possible to bring the country back together, but I think that that the attempt that the president has to make is to talk about we are all Americans, and that is something that Hillary Clinton is doing as part of her closing argument, and to make a very studious effort to woo the other side, to bring in the leaders of the opposition party and to make it very clear that that's what's happening. Now, the problem with that is that a lot of this upset that Steve was talking about in the body politic, the people who feel that way don't like the leaders of their party either. And one of the things we learned during the primaries, for instance, we asked a question in the exit polls about, it wasn't quite worded like this, but it was something like this. Has the Republican leadership abandoned you? It wasn't quite that stark, but close. And in every state where we asked the question, the majority of Republicans coming out of the voting booth said yes. So they don't like their leaders either. So it's very hard to see how you make the kinds of gestures that would resonate. And so it's going to be very tough.
They don't like their leaders because they've been lied to. They've been told, you elect a Republican Congress, and we're going to get rid of Roe v. Wade.
And Obamacare.
And we're going to get rid of Obamacare. And we're going to do this and that. And we're going to build a wall. But that was never going to happen. You have a Democratic president. You had, with a veto, you had enough Democrats in the Senate to filibuster key legislation. It was never, ever going to happen. They were lied to. And now a significant percentage of the Republican Party is saying, wait, you know, you failed us. You didn't keep your promise. But the promise was never going to happen because Donald Trump has repealed a lot of things and changed a lot of assumptions about American politics. But he hasn't repealed the basic laws of politics and the basic way the American system works. And the American system works is to disperse power and force and make sure that one faction and one ideological group does not dominate the politics. But they were told, you will elect conservatives, and that's what's going to happen. And frankly, there's a problem on the left too. As I just mentioned, Bernie Sanders is going to get up there and say, we should enact free tuition for everybody. That is not going to happen. Not with a Republican House, not with enough Republicans in the Senate to filibuster. It's not going to happen. But people are going to say, we've been lied to. Well, yeah, but part of the problem is that there's so much, you know, people do not, you say, how are you going to bring the country together? Let's start by stop the lying. Let's start by telling them the truth about what is possible in a divided government. And one thing that is not possible, either on the right or the left, is enacting a pure ideological program. That is not the way the American system worked. It's not the way it's worked for 240 years. Now, I think that Clinton, I don't know this directly, but I know it indirectly, has already started to reach out to people that she worked with in the Senate. After all, she was there for 8 years. There were a number of Republicans. People forget that Hillary Clinton was actually very bipartisan in many ways in her career in the Senate. I remember very vividly a moment when she came back from a foreign trip with John McCain. I might have been Bosnia or a place like that. And I remember them being interviewed on Meet the Press, and the two of them there, and it was, they were sitting together and they were complimenting each other and they were finishing each other's sentences like an old married couple practically. But it was a moment that I think back on and say, this is actually the real Hillary Clinton in many ways. This is her instinct. But whether she can find a negotiating partner, first of all, she has to have the courage to stand up to the left wing of her party. And Paul Ryan has got to have the courage to stand up to the right wing of his party. And both of them have got to show leadership, and both of them have got to show courage, and both of them have got to be willing to defy the extremes and work together and create bipartisan coalitions. Otherwise, nothing's going to get done, given the way the Congress is almost certainly going to be a system of shared power.
The one other factor here, because people have always made campaign promises, right? But the other factor here is the social media. And the fact that somebody does something and they're vilified immediately on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, and it does make it more difficult.
Much more difficult.
Much more difficult and much nastier. Although nasty's become a good word these days, but much more. It's so vitriolic that it makes it very, very hard.
And I'll tell you another thing that they might do to actually produce some bipartisan legislation is restore earmarks. This was a reform that was supposed to somehow clean up the government. It's been a disaster from the point of view of effective legislating, because earmarks were a lubrication. And you could get people to cooperate if they got something out of the bill. And the way you built legislative coalitions was putting enough things in. Now you can, from an abstract good government point of view, say, oh, that was terrible. But the fact is, that's the way things got done. But it's a very big country. It's a very big legislature. 435 plus 100. How do you get people together? Well, one of the ways you got it was by
people who represent very diverse interests, very diverse districts.
Give them a vested interest in cooperating in legislation where they don't, where it's not ideologically pure.
Well, I see a legislator about to approach us.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Valerie Irvin. I live in Silver Spring. Do you think that the hatred of Hillary Clinton is steeped in the fear that men have about the emerging power and influence of women? It seems that Trump and men of a certain age are terrified of strong, intelligent, and politically motivated women.
I'll let Steve answer this. This was a former Montgomery County council member.
Well, I have been married for 50 years to a strong, intelligent woman. And so I'm not one of the men you're talking about. But do I think that there is a significant amount of truth to what you say? Yes. And I think Trump has reflected it and been actually more candid than I might have expected about it.
And he started it back in January. He started laying the foundation. He was in Iowa in January, talking about her not having the stamina, which was just code, and not even subtle code. You know, it was, she's a woman of a certain age. She certainly doesn't have the stamina.
And doesn't look
Well,
presidential.
then it moved on to look presidential, which means she doesn't look like the guys on the bills, which is a whole nother subject. But so do I think sexism is very much part of this? Absolutely. Was it bound to be? Of course. Come on. I mean, today there was a study out about equal pay, and it's going to take something like 130 years, you know, to get to equal pay. Oh, great. So it is, of course it's there, and some of it is blatant, and most of it is subconscious.
One of the interesting things about gender, though, Val, is that particularly younger women, many of them were not energized by the idea of a woman president. We saw this even in 2008. You know, when I was teaching, I teach at George Washington, and it was very clear to me when I looked at my classes, young women were much more enthusiastic about Barack Obama than they were about Hillary Clinton. And now older women of a certain age,
and this time more enthusiastic about Bernie Sanders than they were.
Women of Hillary's age, Hillary was 4 years behind Cokie at Wellesley.
She turned 69 today.
Yes, it was her birthday. And women of a certain age who fought those battles and had those experiences.
And are still fighting them.
You know, Hillary Clinton did this, absolutely. I mean, Hillary Clinton did this terrific interview with Humans of New York. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's a real insight into her candid. She doesn't talk very candid very often, but this was very candid. She talks about when she was senior in Wellesley going to Harvard to take the LSAT exams, and she was one of only 2 women in the room. And all of these men, of course it was during Vietnam, 1968, and men were saying basically vicious things about, what are you doing here? And you take my place and I'm going to get drafted and die in Vietnam. It was awful.
Harassing, total harassing.
And she talks in that interview about how experiences like that, she built up walls around herself, like so many women of her age who fought those battles. And I think for women who have fought those battles and remember those slights, you know, when we were first married and moved to New York, Cokie went looking for a job, and Newsweek magazine told her flat out, we do not hire women to be writers. There's a woman who eventually wrote 6 national best-selling books, and Newsweek was so brilliant in anticipating her talent that they told her they didn't hire women, right? So, I mean, so older women who felt it were more energized on the gender issue than younger women. What I think was really interesting about the latest turn of events, the tape, the sex tape, plus the nasty woman crack, I've seen a difference. I think the issue of sexual harassment cut through to a lot of women who were not identifying with Hillary as a woman, didn't see that as a critical factor, but identified with the experiences of women who have felt abused by men in those situations. And I think that changed some of the psychology. I think you saw a break point there where a lot of younger women said, wait, gender does matter. And the experiences of women provided more of a sense of solidarity. But it wasn't the pay equity that's always been there. That didn't really cause that emotional reaction so much as the sexual assault.
But
My
also,
sense of it is it really cut through
he gave her a
something.
slogan. You know, she had been searching for some kind of slogan, and you know, read the emails. They search endlessly for anything. But nasty woman has become
Instantly.
just became an instant show of solidarity. And you go on the web and put in nasty woman, and up come the shirts, the cups, the tote bags. As I say, it's like a public radio pledge drive. Next question, please.
Hi, Clarence. For those of you who don't know this gentleman, he's the head of the Montgomery County Historical Society Speakers Bureau. And
Thank you. I'm Clarence Hickey from Rockville. You've already addressed this a bit, but I have concern that in times past, Americans were very good about everyone giving a little and everyone sacrificing a bit for the common good, for the national good. This seems to be waning now, maybe even gone, appears to me. But I'm just wondering, is this a correct observation? What can we do
It
about it?
depends on what times past you're talking about. So one of the things that has shaped all of our perceptions of American politics is the history that many of us grew up in or were, or for some of you, your parents grew up in. And that is the post-World War II period. And that was actually aberrational. And it was the most bipartisan period in our history. And so to come out of that into this is a shock. But that period really was one where the entire country went to war. And reporters who covered the war wore the uniform. And everybody was on the same side. And not only did all the men and few women who actually were in the services go to war, but everybody was accepted rationing and all of that. So the country was at war all together. And the Congress was made up of those men, and it was men. So there was an enormous class of 1946, of more than 110 members, freshmen, Republican class. And then an enormous Democratic class of 1948, I think 118 of them. And they were all very self-conscious veterans. They ran as the men who went, not the men who sent. And they had literally been in foxholes together and had been in hospitals together after the war. And so their sense of common purpose was enormous. And they knew the enemy was the dictator across the sea, not the guy across the aisle. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't moments. There was McCarthy was in this period. But by and large, what you had was a sense of common purpose. And the Cold War extended that. And then you came to a point, this is the first Congress where we have no World War II veteran.
the last World War II veteran in the House, Ralph Hall, I believe, just left the Congress. Frank Lautenberg was the last senator to serve in World War II.
But you had Dan Inouye and Ted Stevens, who were the chairman and ranking members of the Appropriations Committee, who were so respectful of each other because of their service in the war. And Stevens would always say about Inouye, and they would switch off as chairman, but he would always say, Danny goes first because he's a Medal of Honor winner. And that was what was the significant factor. So I do think that that is part of what all of our generation and the people we raised are somewhat absorbing as how America used to be. And that's true, it's how it used to be in that period, but it's not how it used to be throughout our history.
I would make another point, Clarence, which is I wouldn't just look at the national level. Look around here tonight. Everybody is here because they're committed to the community, because they feel some stake. It's not Democrats and Republicans here tonight, right? It's people who share a sense of community and are volunteering your time, contributing to the Historical Society. About half of you, this is the third event this week that you've been to, because you're so involved in so many other causes on a local level. I see in a place like Montgomery County an enormously vibrant community life with so many people contributing their time and their money to make this community better, starting with the Slavin family, but not ending with the Slavin family. You know, every single building you go to in Montgomery County has got a wall of contributors. There's a slave and name on it, right? So I understand your point, but if you look at it from the ground up, not the top down, this is a wonderful country. With so many people contributing every day to the welfare of their communities and their neighborhoods and their counties. So, you know, it's a different perspective, and I'm not Pollyanna about it, but let's not think everything is gloomy, because it's not. And the people in this room reflect that.
Well, on that nice note, we're going to take another break, and then we'll be back.
The discussion continues when we return.
I've been reading Common Sense by Thomas Paine. I've got national elections on the brain. You want a revolution, I want a revelation. So how you gonna change the nation? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And when you vote for president, you get to pick who participates in the sequel. Work, vote, vote, America. Vote, vote, the time is now. Vote, vote, decide who wins this. Vote.
And now, back to an evening with Steve and Cokie Roberts.
Hi, we're back for our evening for Montgomery history. I'm Cokie Roberts with Steve Roberts, a fellow I've known for a while. And we are continuing our question segment. So whoever has the first question, please come on up and let us hear what you would like to know about.
Hi, my name is Bill Conway. I live in Potomac. You've partially answered this already, but my question is, recognizing the economic pain and social dislocation motivating Donald Trump's supporters, what nevertheless explains their willingness to overlook his disqualifying flaws? By that I mean sexism, bigotry, ignorance of policy, lack of emotional control, narcissism, etc.
Thank you for that neutral question, Bill. Bill and I served together on the board of Montgomery County History, as Bob Bachman, who's here as well, several other people from the association. Look, Cokie made this point, and you got to remember, the single biggest determination of someone's vote is party ID, Bill. So the fact is that everybody starts with 40% of the vote, no matter who the party nominates. You got to remember that the single worst performing candidate in modern American political history was George McGovern in 1972, who won one state. George McGovern got 38% of the vote. So there's a base there, there's a floor there that is, you know, Donald Trump said at one point, you know, I could go down Fifth Avenue and kill people, it wouldn't cost me voters. There was some truth to that, because there's a core group that is going to vote Republican no matter what. Add to two other factors: a profound hatred of Hillary Clinton. The fact is, this is not just an ordinary Democratic candidate to a lot of Republicans. This is someone that they have despised for a generation and distrusted for a generation. And so you hear it all the time, people who are very well aware of Trump's flaws and failings, and say, but she's worse because she's a liar and she's dishonest, and
Lock her up.
Lock her up, right? I mean, he himself those chants are reflective of the feelings, the deep-seated animosity that people feel that goes way beyond simply party ID number one, hatred of Hillary number two. The third factor that you hear a lot of people talking about is the Supreme Court. The fact is that the single most tangible consequence of this vote is who gets to fill that, not only that one vacancy we already know about, but the likelihood of several other vacancies. People on both sides care about the Supreme Court. But the truth is that the conservative base of the Republican Party actually historically has cared more about that issue. Because if you think about so many of the issues that they feel so deeply about, starting with abortion but not ending with abortion, it's the Supreme Court that is going to, gun rights is another example, although the Heller case settled that to some extent. But if you, over the last generation, this has been an extremely important issue to the conservative base of the Republican Party. And so I know of a number of people who say, I can't stand Trump. I think he's all the things you mentioned. But who do I want naming that person in the Supreme Court, because a lot of people understand that that is the single most important thing a president does in many ways, apart from declaring war, and certainly the one that has the longest lasting effect. Look at, Antonin Scalia was on the bench for 30 years. So you look
at John Paul Stevens. I mean, Jerry Ford was president for 15 minutes, and John Paul Stevens was on the court for decades.
And by the way, it's not just the Supreme Court. It's also the lower courts. One of the shrewdest things Ronald Reagan did as president was pick lower court judges who were younger and who were committed to staying on the bench. And he had a much longer impact. His appointments had a much longer impact on the character of the federal bench, because it was a very conscious strategy on his part to try to pick judges in their 40s, and particularly people who were committed to staying on the bench through their careers. Not, it wasn't happening with everybody, but it was one of the most important lasting impacts of the Reagan presidency. So those are some of the explanations of why people are looking past the personal flaws in Trump and saying there are other issues that I care about.
Hi, I'm Ralph Bugles from Rockville, Maryland. If the polls that you cited are correct and Hillary Clinton is the next president, is there some sort of large enough margin of victory that she could achieve that would overcome Republican congressional obstruction?
It's hard to know what it would be, because again, it's hard to come by a landslide in a country as divided as we are. I think one argument that could be made is for people in states like Maryland and New York and Illinois and California who think that their votes don't count, that to make the case for getting a very large popular vote can make a certain amount of sense. But even so, I think that it's going to be very difficult to get to a point that is just a big enough vote, because of the divisions, because the closeness of the division.
And as Cokie pointed out in the beginning, the polls are narrowing slightly, and Clinton's lead in all the national polls has shrunk a bit. But you got to remember, Barack Obama only won by 3.9% of the vote and won 332 electoral votes. So the margin is magnified. The Electoral College margin is often much larger than the popular vote margin, for all the reasons we know. I think the single biggest factor there, Ralph, is not her margin, it's what happens in the Senate. Because if the Democrats are able to win the Senate, that gives them a much more leverage, and that's the single biggest asset she would have. Because you got to remember, even if you all know the numbers, if the Democrats win, Kane becomes vice president, then they need a net gain of 4 seats in the Senate. 50-50, vice president casts the deciding vote. And you say, well, that doesn't sound like much. I mean, it's all still going to be close votes.
And it's not 60.
And but you got to remember, you control the Senate even by 50-50, by 1 vote. You control all the committees. Every committee chairman is a Democrat. Every Democrats control the floor. They control what legislation is brought up. They control what amendments are called up. And they control investigations. They have the power of the subpoena. One of the single hidden consequences of any election is summed up in the word subpoena. Because if you have the majority in the Congress, you can hold hearings, you can hold as Hillary Clinton found out from the Benghazi investigation. So that, to my mind, is probably a more important question than her popular vote margin. If the Democrats can succeed in winning the Senate, that will give them a lot more leverage. It certainly will help her a lot on appointments, judicial and other appointments. But that will change the dynamic in the Congress more than the popular vote.
Good evening. I'm Teresa Flanders from Kensington, Maryland. And my question is, given the large number of people who are vying for the position, how do you account for Donald Trump being the Republican candidate?
You mean in the Republican primaries, given the large number of people?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Steve talked about it to some degree, of this sense of voicelessness on the part of a lot of people who are displaced in this country. The analogy I keep making is that it's like the Industrial Revolution. that people were forced off the farm and into cities, and in some cases across the ocean. Everything that had gone before no longer existed, and everything that had been valued was no longer valued. That was particularly true for women, because home manufacture was no longer valued, and you were paid for the hours you put in instead of the work you produced, and so everything was turmoil. And that's really what's happened with the technological revolution, is that people whose lives were recognizable and they thought their children's lives would be recognizable have been completely disrupted, and they're furious, and they feel they're not valued, and that's very strong, that sense of not being valued, and therefore they want somebody to give voice to that. And you combine that sense of not being in the job you expected to have for the rest of your life, where you would have a good enough living that you'd have a house and a boat, and your kids would probably do that and maybe a little better. And you combine that with the cultural and demographic changes, and people look around and say, I don't recognize this. I don't recognize this place. And so you have somebody who's a star, a huge celebrity, and you might not have watched The Apprentice. I didn't watch The Apprentice, but millions and millions of Americans did. And he comes in and says, I'm going to make America great again. That's a very appealing message for people who have felt that nobody has heard them. And I think that the combination of the fact that he had that message, that he was such a celebrity, that we in the media gave him vast amounts of free time, and that the Republican Party was so divided that they couldn't get together behind somebody else, all of that militated to making him the nominee.
Yeah, I mentioned also the racism and the xenophobia, which I think was fueled part of it. I think the media's role is very important in a number of ways. It's not just that he was a star on The Apprentice, which is absolutely true. But let's remember, Donald Trump might have been an amateur politician. He was a professional entertainer. He had a brilliant command of television. He understood that television, the very nature of television, values two things. It values an outsized personality, and it values conflict. And the moment of Donald Trump on television, this huge figure saying, "You're fired," is quintessential television. And he understood it in his fingertips, and we manipulated news media, which was hungry for ratings and income. One of the head of CBS said at one point, in a burst of candor, it might be bad for the country, but it's great for CBS. Keep it up, Donald, the money's rolling in. Les Moonves, head of CBS, actually said it. So he understood this, he understood the vulnerability, he understood the greed, and he played on it because he did produce ratings, and he had a great command of television. But you combine that with his command of social media. Barack Obama was good on social media, but in many ways Trump was even more deft at his use of it, particularly understanding Twitter, which was not a factor when Barack Obama first ran. You cannot, I defy you, you cannot say anything intelligent in 140 characters.
I disagree.
Okay, but here's what I think you can do. You can be snarky, you can be edgy, you can be insulting, you can drive other coverage by being outrageous. And he understood this. And it wasn't just that he had millions and millions of followers on social media, so he could sit there at 3 o'clock in the morning, Trump Tower, and broadcast, in effect. He had his own broadcasting network. I mean, he had the TBS, TBN, Trump Broadcasting Network in many ways, because Obama has the OBN too. But Trump built on that and mastered social media to communicate with millions and millions of people instantly. And let's remember, every one of those people who was a follower of Trump on Twitter or Facebook then had their own followers. And you can see this. Cokie mentioned the spread of the nasty woman meme. Well, think about how often Trump's tweets just spread like wildfire through the Twitterverse, and then the next morning drove all the coverage of the old media, because every morning show was talking about it. And everybody was desperate for Donald Trump to call in and talk about what he just tweeted about. And so there was this co-conspiracy between Trump and the media in many ways, where they both benefited enormously from the relationship. I would mention one other factor as well, and that is the failure of the other Republicans. Right. Donald Trump did not win the nomination in a vacuum. The fact is he had 16 opponents, many of whom we thought would be good candidates, and none of them proved to be good candidates. Jeb Bush proved to be the single worst candidate in modern political history.
He spent $150 million on TV ads.
And so when Donald, as you mentioned earlier, there are a lot of things Donald Trump says that are not true, but calling Jeb Bush low energy was not one of his lies. and some of it was the fragmentation of 16 other candidates, but it was also the failure of any of the others to fill that space. And the fact is, Trump was not the overwhelming favorite of the Republican Party. If you add up all the votes in all the Republican primaries, Donald Trump got 41% of the Republican vote, which means a very clear majority of Republicans wanted somebody else. But the failure of any one of those other 16 to come forward and challenge him as a political force is also part of the explanation.
Well, and also at the very end, it came down to him and Ted Cruz. And people in the Congress couldn't stand Ted Cruz. And so they really couldn't stand Ted Cruz. And so people like Bob Dole started coming out for Trump, and it gave him some legitimacy and it was really because of their attitudes toward Cruz. I never went on Twitter before this campaign. And I now follow the Pope on Twitter, and he makes lots of sense in 140 characters. Next question.
I'm Marlene Goldschmidt from Potomac. How can you stay unbiased and maintain your professionalism without losing it?
Well, I think in this campaign, we abandoned unbiased when it came to Donald Trump. And we had a long conversation about it, and really decided that it was important not to pretend that he was a normal candidate. And as I heard, as I've heard many people say, but a fellow from the UN saying the other day that at some point you have to look yourself in the mirror and say, if I didn't call him out, I am guilty. And so we made that decision. It was not easy, and we have taken a good bit of heat for it.
We, you and me, or the media?
You and me.
Oh.
But in general, we try to just put it out there the way it is, and I don't think that's terribly hard. I think that that's kind of you look at it and see what's there and say what you see.
Look, we're both very old school. I went to work for the New York Times when I was 21 years old. I had exactly 1 week between college and the New York Times, and I worked there for 25 years. Entering the New York Times at that point was a bit like entering the monastery. Fortunately, it did not require a vow of either chastity or poverty. But it was very traditional, and that's the tradition I come out of. But as Cokie mentioned, I think two things have happened. I think that, I teach media ethics. In fact, that's one of the reasons I was late tonight, because I was teaching a class at GW on media ethics, and we talk about these issues all the time. And I do think it is entirely possible for a professional to have an opinion and still be unbiased in the reports. I think a lot of professionals do that all the time. I think ministers do it. I think doctors do it. I think therapists do it. I think it is entirely possible to be professional. And I think most of the people in this room know what I mean by professionalism. A lot of you are professionals. You pride yourself on having a set of ethics, a set of standards that guide you in your work. And we do too. We don't pretend that we don't have opinions, but in fact, tonight on my class, I was quoting an intelligent man named Michael Kinsley, who said the key is not to pretend we don't have opinions. The key is to make sure your opinions don't become a bias, by which he means it doesn't affect your work. And I do think in most cases that is possible. But there are two things about the Trump phenomenon. One is, it is so profoundly divided America. The only year that in my more than 50 years as a reporter, that I can compare this year to is 1968. In 1968, the generation gap, the emotions created,
and the
assassinations and the demonstrations, and the Chicago, where we both were. Cokie's dad was chairman of the platform committee in the Chicago convention. I was covering the riots outside for the New York Times, and emotions ran so deeply that it pushed reporters right to the edge, and in some cases over the edge of impartiality, because the emotions were so profoundly strong. I think to some extent that's happened with Trump, but I think something more important has happened. We've had this debate, not just the two of us, but this debate has gone through the entire media community. What do you do in a situation where you have a candidate who has basically defied all of the traditional rules of accountability, where when you prove over and over again things he said are not true, and it doesn't make any difference. He doesn't correct himself, doesn't apologize, continues to tell the lies. How can you serve your constituents, your stakeholders effectively?
Meaning your readers, listeners,
yes,
viewers.
Exactly. If you don't ratchet up your aggressiveness in terms of challenging a man who is going to roll over you otherwise. And look, this is dangerous. We're taking a risk here, and it's not comfortable for a lot of us. But the growing feeling all year has been, and you can see it happening. New York Times ran a story just maybe 2 months ago in which they used, it happened after Trump's riff about Hillary was really responsible for the birther movement and I was the hero. And New York Times ran an article about that, and the headline said, Donald Trump lied. Now, I have been reading the New York Times for 50 years. I worked for them for 25, and I have never seen a headline like that, ever. And if you noticed it, maybe you've noticed it, maybe you haven't, but more and more within news stories, not editorials, people will say, Donald Trump said this, and it's false, in the news story. Or
inaccurately stated.
And that is a result of a media-wide decision. Each reporter, each producer, each media outlet did this independently. It's not as if we all met in the basement of the New York Times and came up with this conspiracy.
No, the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yeah, it was actually Bilderberg. But the fact is, Trilateral Commission. But the fact is that we were faced with this enormously difficult problem. How do we serve our readers and listeners accurately when one of the candidates has changed the rules? And there was an interview with Dean Beckett, the editor of the New York Times, on NPR, David Folkenflik, their media reporter, in which Folkenflik says to Beckett, I'm reading these new headlines. I'm reading this new tone in the paper. Is that a change? And Beckett says, yes. It's a very conscious change that we decided that we have to do this in order to serve our readers. I talk to my students about this. You know, you take an organization like PolitiFact, very good fact-checking our organization in Florida. They've done a study. They've fact-checked Hillary, they've fact-checked Trump, and they apply the same standards of veracity to both of them. But they've concluded that 13% of the time, that 13% of the statements that they have fact-checked of Hillary's are lies. 13%. 53% of Trump's are lies. Now, how do you convey that imbalance and still seem fair? You're applying the same metric of veracity, but the results are so wildly different. And the traditional view often was, well, you say Hillary lied on this and Trump lied on that. But that wasn't good enough anymore. That phrase, false equivalency, more and more people realize it was not good enough. It's a very uncomfortable feeling for a lot of us, as Cokie indicated. We are not happy doing this, but a lot of us individually and a lot of news organizations decided we simply had to.
We have very little time left, so come quickly and ask your question, and we'll answer it quickly.
Bill Stewart from Falls Church, Virginia. What is
You
your view?
came across water.
Very slowly. What is your view of the abundance of polls and their impact on the election?
I don't think they have much impact on the election. In fact, I think there are a lot of people who want to prove the pollsters wrong, and maybe will. But I find them useful, not particularly for the horse race. I've never found horse race polls useful. But I think that they're very useful for telling us who's voting how or thinking of voting in a certain way and why. And that allows us to do an analysis of where the American electorate is that is very, very useful if you're in our business, and also what issues people say they're caring about. And that is something that you know, sometimes is a big surprise to people, but not only in the media, but in politics. And that can be very useful as well.
No matter how often pollsters say these are not predictions, these are snapshots in time, people don't listen, right? But that's what they are. They are not predictions of what the outcome's going to be 2 weeks from now. That's what the electorate looks like tonight. But people don't understand that. Second thing is that any one poll can be inaccurate and an outlier. So the way I read polls is I go to the website Real Clear Politics, which averages all of the polls every day.
We disagree about this.
So I prefer, I look at individual polls, but I also look at the averages because I think that will mitigate the outliers who can be skewed. It is increasingly hard for pollsters because of cell phones. You know, when I started in this business, I did a lot of work for the New York Times on polling and was very involved in their polling operation. And we could call landlines, and we knew where people were, right? But now with cell phones, my students have cell phones from 20 different area codes sitting in my classroom, right? And so how do you reach them, and how do you have some sense of who they really are? So polling is much, much more difficult today, and pollsters are trying very hard to compensate for this, but it is an enormous challenge. I think we've both learned over the years to read polls in a certain way. There are certain kinds of questions which are useless. If you ask someone, what do you think? I never look at that question.
Or the hypotheticals.
Never look at those questions. What I look at is when you ask people to tell you about their lives. It's the same adage I have when I do the radio and host the Diane Rehm show. I ask callers, tell me what you know, not what you think, okay? So you got to read polls carefully, look at them, look at the questions where people are asked, what do you know? And then you'll get something valuable out of them.
Well, it's been very interesting to hear what you know and what you wanted to know from us. It was a great evening to be with you. I think that not only was it lovely to have an event for Montgomery history, but also on Montgomery County Media, which is such a valuable service to our community. The more that we lose coverage, local coverage in newspapers, the more that local newspapers close down, the more valuable an organization like Montgomery County Media is. So we're thrilled to be here with you tonight. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Stephen Cokie, for your time this evening. Again, as we've talked about this evening, a very historic election, perhaps the most historic in our lifetimes, and to have in all this consternation and confusion about the information going out there, we're so fortunate in this country, in this county, to have two outstanding journalists with us to help cut through the heat and give us the light. So again, thank you to Stephen Cokie. And let me also point out that, you know, they are, as you can imagine, they're well documented of serving this country and being very much well in demand. And the fact is, they dedicated their time, contributed their time to be here tonight in support of Montgomery County Historical Society. So again, thanks for their contributions as well. Just a couple more thanks. Want to thank the Doris and Sanford Slavin Foundation. Jeffrey Slavin, again, thank you for support tonight. Key Ingredients Catering that contributed so much to be here tonight as well. Thanks to them. And again, a big thanks to the Montgomery County Historical Society and Montgomery Community Media, the staffs who came together for months in preparation, hundreds of hours of contributed time to make tonight's event. So again, thank you to those staffs very much. And again, thank you very much for coming this evening. We really appreciate it. Have a good night. Thank you very much.